Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Project Kids, and today is a little different than our usual thing. We are starting our sort of summer camp interactive working group today, and that will occur straight after this recording that Michael and I are making for public consumption. And this is going to be a very interesting endeavor we are off on. So please make sure if you are interested in joining us for the workshop portion of this, that you contact me at technobrat21@gmail.com so you can join us. This will be, people can join the group later on. They'll have some catching up to do. But if what we're doing here with these Project Kids shows is interesting you and you would like to participate in some very interesting stuff going on off of the recording, then hit me up. All right, Michael, it's been a couple weeks. We're back. We have a new endeavor going on today, and you just came back from an adventure, and my life is weird and always an adventure. How you doing?
I'm doing great. You know, I'm happy to be here. Yeah, the last couple days have been a fun little roller coaster out of my normal routine, and I'm happy to be here with all of our new participants and excited to see what unfolds.
Absolutely. So we have the people participating in the group here listening as we record this, because there will be crossover between what's talked about. So we're doing it in front of a live group sort of for the first time. And yeah, it's kind of exciting. It's very exciting. So a couple of things. So just to throw things off, just as we get started, in between when I just talked to you a little while ago and now, Michael, I made an interesting discovery and my own little synchronicity about Chatsworth, because Michael and I were talking a little bit ago just about exactly what we were wanting to do here, because he'd been out of town for a little bit. And I decided for some reason that I was going to make a backdrop for this of Chatsworth, of the place where I went to summer camp, right? And for some reason that became very important to me. So I'm searching Chatsworth on Google in images. And of course, it's not showing me Chatsworth, California. Right, what it's showing me is Chatsworth House in England. Have I told you about this, Michael?
No.
Okay, so I grew up in Chatsworth, and it is named after Chatsworth House in Devonshire, England. And so the Chatsworth in California is on the corner of Devonshire and Mason. It took Andrew Bashago explaining that to me as an adult before I put those connections together, even though it was always right there, right? And so somehow, I don't know if they're on a same ley line or why they decided this is a good spot. Maybe it has something to do with the land separately or whatever. So what comes up is all this Chatsworth House stuff. And there's some interesting, like I have your book right here, right? And I'm going to talk about this in a second. But there's the Chatsworth House is in front of a river that has a bridge right like that over it, right? And the area in Chatsworth where my camp was that I was looking at, to try and find a picture that I wanted to use, I ended up getting more interested in something else and forgetting to look for a picture, is right around this area called the Santa Susquehanna Pass. Susquehanna, Susquehanna, right?
Right.
And there's all sorts of similar things around the area in Chatsworth as there are in some of the places that you describe in your book here, for this, with the rites at the 40th parallel. So I got very in, I was like looking at all this. So at some point, maybe you and I are just going to have to go through and take a look at this Chatsworth House and Chatsworth and whatever, and do some kind of correlative show here or whatnot. But
I'm looking at it right now. I see the bridge you're talking about. So yeah, I'm excited to go down that path at some point.
And on Santa Susquehanna Pass, there's a radiation leak, just like 3 Mile Island. There's water and power processing plants back there. It all has all the same stuff that you have along your Susquehanna, right? In this area of Chatsworth, there is not a river back there, but that there is a lake called Lake Maynard back there, which Maynard also refers to something, like a castle, manors, or where they have castles and blah, 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 that kind of stuff. So it is kind of interesting. But when I saw that bridge right over the water sitting in front of the Chatsworth House in Devonshire, England, I was like, oh, that's interesting. So
yeah. I'm looking at that right now.
So we'll have to dig into that. And part of the reason I'm talking about that is we were preparing for this, I went over, Michael sent me his The Rites of the 40th Parallel booklet a while back. And I was very busy at the time, and I kind of looked through it and whatever. I was like, oh yeah, it's very interesting, and da-da-da. But the last couple of days, I really have been reading it and sitting with it. And for anybody who is joining us on this journey, whether you're actually participating in the group or whether you're just following along with the videos at home or on Patreon or whatever, I actually think that everyone should get this and start doing these rites. You don't have to be at the Susquehanna to do them. He's outlined plenty of techniques for participating, either with different geographic locations or through sort of projection or whatnot. Lots of you guys have remote viewing skills and things like that, so you can actually transport yourself there. But this, as we do this, if people are working on this privately in the background, I think it's going to really help through this process. You sort of outline what I really like about sort of transmutating personal emotional garbage and things like that in order to allow the sort of, wise self. In fact, I'm going to read kind of I just want to read this little part here before we get started with whatever else we're going to talk about what it says. So here, it might seem there's a few things in here that you're going to have to read the book to get the context for, but I think you guys get it. The singularity is predicted to occur in 2045. A quick look at world events reveals a possibility for the planet to self-destruct before that date is even reached. But rest assured, Bacon knew of the potential dangers of what he was unleashing, and he included throughout his many works a plan for humanity to avoid this end. Bacon being Francis Bacon. Michael's talked extensively about his connection with the Susquehanna River and whatnot. Bacon understood that individual salvation was the key for collective survival. When the individual transmutates emotional garbage from life's trials, he becomes the wisdom version of self. This is what personal transformation is all about. When this happens on a large scale, humanity reaches the collective level of emotional maturity needed to harmoniously live with each other and handle, in this case, advanced technology. So this group that we're sort of forming is like a miniature version of that, right? Like the microcosm of the macrocosm kind of thing. And it says here that, in the pages that follow, you will find all the information you need to participate with the Rites of the 40th Parallel for your own personal transformation. This information is meant to serve your personal growth and to bring about healing while also providing a means to participate in the collective work of building heaven on earth. And that is really what we are trying to do here. So this is a small working group that if, it doesn't take everybody in the world doing it to start to have a big effect on things. And so we're starting with us. So that was it from his just sort of introduction to all of this. And then as I was going through, I kind of had a really good understanding of why Michael and I are able to connect the way we do, and why this is coming together in the way it is. And he was doing this at a very similar time that I was doing my own transmutation and growth process. And both of us were using significant natural places, me Chatsworth and him the Susquehanna River, as sort of the backdrop, but really in an interactive way for our own personal transformation. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more when we go into the group part, but it has a lot to do with walking, how important walking is, the power of walking, and being able to work through your emotions and discard all, work through the pain of it, discard that part, and find the tools that lie underneath it. So we're going to get into some of that later today. But I just wanted to say, I was really glad to have gone back and looked at this again. Something told me that before we started this process, I needed to go take another look. And I'm glad that I did. And I think everybody who's listening should go check this out. It's gloriously simple. And you know what I mean? Like a lot of books on personal growth and transformation are huge tomes that are sometimes difficult to understand. This is not that. This is very easy to understand. Michael's done a great job of breaking these things down, simplifying them, and offering resources if you want to go into more complexity about it. But this is a great place for everybody to sort of start that journey. So good job, Michael.
Well, thank you. And it was a real pleasant surprise when you said that you wanted to talk about that today, because I wrote that, I don't know, like 4 years ago, something like that. And, obviously so much of the world has changed in the last 4 years. And obviously that's also individually, and I've changed so much. And there's this, I mean, I don't think I'm the only one. Like whenever you create something and then you look back at it 4 years later, there's like part of you that's like, you notice how much you've changed. Like, oh, you know, I don't know what does that really ring as true for me as it used to do? And I sometimes feel that way. And I haven't read that for a long time. And I sell a good number of those. And so like every time it goes out, there's like, do I want to read this again? Do I like this? That was 4 years ago that I looked at it. So hearing you pick it up and like reading it to me, like really encouraged me to maybe go back and look at that myself. But then also what's happening is I have been rewriting the beginning. I want to have currently, like, you know, the last couple of months I've been putting energy into redoing like a second version of it and going a little bit more into like the Susquehanna mystery and why I think it's, you know, why that aspect, because I don't really go into the Susquehanna mystery. I just go into like, well, you know, this is how we can utilize a natural resource and tap into like natural reality in a deep emotion, like human way. So the timing of that is perfect. And then also this trip, which I took this weekend, ties in with it as well. So thanks for that. And then the second thing, which I'm really excited about you sharing this within this group, was when you mentioned like a lot of people here have remote viewing capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
When I wrote that, I had in my mind, like I was inspired by the whole sort of like Disney World mapping. Like if you go to an amusement park, you know, they give you that map. And, you know, we've got like an interesting relationship with Disney, you know, like how,
Yeah.
and so like we can go and invert and play with the stuff they play with. So what I think have done so well is the way they utilize maps and made it very fun. And like, they're not exactly to scale maps, but they are accurate depictions of a territory. So I took that, and the Rites to the 40th parallel highlight 4 specific locations at what has been identified as the sweet spot on the you know, arguably the planet's oldest river, are identified by both the Rosicrucians, by the Freemasons, and then also by a long line of the native people of both North America and Mesoamerica have identified this the 40th parallel at the Susquehanna River. And I've identified 4 locations and did a little bit of geomancy. Like, you know, I interpreted what the landscape is and I explained that and then tie that into the personal transformative experience. But then I did these maps, these Disneyland maps of the location. And I wrote that, like I had 2 things in mind when I did this book. One was, all of this is within a handful of hours drive from New York City, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C., this megatropolis along the East Coast. So it's like, I knew that there were 400 million people within a day's car trip to go and have these experiences. But then I also wanted, because so much has happened on the river, computer technology, globalism, and 3-wire distribution of electricity, which has affected everyone on the globe. That's why, you know, all of these rituals were done there. That I wanted to be able to have people utilizing their active imagination skills to be able to go and have that experience. So that's when I stole the idea of the Disneyland map. And if you look in the last 4 pages of the book, you'll see like big things of the map, which can be ripped out. And I always envision people to like put them on their bulletin board, just have it like in the backdrop of their mindset. And so like whenever they want to tap into something like the destructive element, when I'm ready to let something go, when I want something to die, you know, I'm ready to move on in my life, whether that's like moving off of sugar or moving off of a relationship or moving off of a mindset, like this is how I tap. And what I like so much, and I do this myself, is like I always, like almost like you see on Google Earth where you drop in that like little person on the map and you can see the street view. Like that's what I envision, to like drop yourself in on these maps. So the idea that this group we're working with are all like familiar with like this like active imagination, remote viewing, whatever you want to call it, the ability to take your consciousness and playfully go somewhere and do something, you know, that's like, that really, really like excites me. And I'm immensely grateful that you shared this here, and that, you know, people are going to go and play with it, hopefully. So thanks for that, you know, for all folks.
Absolutely. And I want to make a recommendation as you think about revisiting this book. This one of the things that's so glorious about this is its simplicity. And the fact that you haven't included the stories from the Susquehanna mystery in it, I think so my suggestion would be, when people want to do this, that they do this first, and then when you make a second version, then they can go back through with that. Because what's glorious about this is there's not much story to it. And one of the things that I have, so when I was sitting with this, like it seemed like about the same period of time, you and I were both going through this personal transformation. We were doing a lot of walking. We were beginning to, you know, do this sort of taking personal responsibility for everything kind of thing, like owning our emotions, dealing with them, all of this kind of stuff. And prior to that, for myself, I had been caught up in my story. And whenever there was a chance to be, attach myself to another story, then I would do that instead of just like being with what is, right? Right. And sort of taking responsibility and working with it. And when I went through that period of time where I was just starting to take responsibility for my diet, my emotions, everything, going out and walking every day, I was not doing that. And I was just letting whatever was there come and dealing with my own thing. Right. And so I think for a lot of people who this could be helpful for, the same thing happens. People, like, we tend to get caught up in story, right? We tend to, what happens to us? Is it like what happened to someone else? There's this crazy thing. This is an evil plot of land. Bad things happen here, blah, 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 right? So I actually think that like doing the basic trip through first is important, right? Now I can, like when I used to hear all these crazy stories about Chatsworth, I would get all confused in my own crap and whatever. And I kind of stopped doing it, kind of felt out my own thing, and in fact discovered things that were true, that were my personal reality, that later I heard, like later in recent things that have just come out in the last year or so, like stories have come out about that. But I wasn't influenced by the story. The story came out about it after I had done my personal resolution of what I thought had happened there. And then there was evidence to back that. Now I can go engage with all these stories about what Chatsworth is, with the, you know, all the military, the weapons companies that are there, that with the Manson tunnel stuff, with the, you know, child trafficking and whatever, without it, like, of like changing and affecting how I deal with myself in a way, right? So I was ready to start to re-engage the stories again. But I think there's something beautiful and simple about it the way that it is, and having like a version 2 for sort of after people had kind of done these rites for themselves, and then they can kind of go back and see how all of this mystery winds into it and sort of go into a deeper exploration. Once you've taken personal responsibility for yourself, then the deeper explanation of seeing where that story ties to you, right, can I think happen without you getting lost in story, right? So I'd say like do a first round through and a second round through edition, so people can kind of progress their way through it as they become more able to accurately sort of situate themselves in relation to the overall mystery, right?
Well, that's good advice. I appreciate it. Like, I'm thinking, like, as you're saying that, I'm like, well, then maybe I just do it like text format ebook or something. So, which is a whole lot easier than like I love hands-on, like I like things in my hands. I want a book in my hands. I want to write notes, but okay, I that might be a nice way to go and bridge the two, because to really appreciate the depth of like why that location is so important, like you need, like when you hear those details, it's like, you know, it goes to a different level, but you're right. It's more about the personal experience and less so about like that story. Yeah.
You know, once you've had your own personal experience there and you figure out some things for yourself, you always have that. And then you're not as easily influenced, right, by sort of what everyone else's story about
Right.
because you know what yours is. Yeah. So anyway, it's really cool, guys. I love how you did it. I love your Disney maps. I love all your art on your website. I love the way you draw yourself on some of these things. I very much enjoy it. So
Thank you.
did you do the drawings?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're great.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So let's kind of get into, let's do this. I would like to hear your crazy getaway you just had and some of the stories that you had. And then what I'm going to do is then we had somebody who I hope was able to be with us today. She wasn't able to be with us, but I'm going to share. I did speak with her for about an hour, and I'm going to share some of her thoughts and stories just because I think they're kind of interesting as we begin this process that we're going to be doing in the group of sort of moving from a space of things are happening to us to and we're bothered by them to being amused by them and later learning to control them. And I felt like she was just a great example of somebody who was ready for that journey, and her stories sort of reflected that. And so I'm going to do that before we break off and go into the group. So let's hear about your interesting weekend on an island in the Susquehanna.
All right. So this was Jenny, my partner, was her birthday. So we wanted to go, and we've been traveling a bunch, like with family or to family sites this summer. Went down to Tennessee and which was fantastic. The Tennessee River, which was the beginning of we went to Chattanooga, where the beginning of the Trail of Tears began, and it's got a real rich and sad history of the last 400-year story on the United States. But we're kind of getting into that space, and then from there we went into Asheville, North Carolina, and then we did some stuff on the coast on Maryland, and all of that was family related. But this time was a birthday, and we're like, this is just going to be the two of us. And Jenny went, she's like, well, let's go find as remote of a place as we can. And she finds this place. We live in Lancaster, which is, all things being relative, I don't think of Lancaster as being a rural place at all. It's a pretty high, particularly where we are, relatively high concentration of density of human beings. I think the county's got 500,000 people, but relative to a major metropolitan area, this would be rural. So we went to a place where we consider rural. And so this is in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania. And she found this place on Hip Camp, and it's an island which you have to canoe to get on, and we're the only ones on the island. And I've got this picture in my head of what I think this experience is going to be. So we pack up and we drive 2 hours through the mountains. And so what was so cool was the first part of our trip, which began in July when we went down through Tennessee, and we went to a lot of mound sites within Tennessee. There's a certain flavor which you get in that part of the Appalachian Mountains. And now we're in this other part, in the northern part. And we're going through there, and we're just noticing how everything looks different, how people feel differently. We're noticing just how many people are wearing masks driving, how many people aren't, just all of the different sort of flavors. We're in the same kind of part of the world, the same mountain chain, but we're separated really clearly, at least within American history, through this Mason-Dixon line sort of stuff. So we go and we arrive in this island, and this guy picks us up, and we take our canoe down, and we find our campsite along in the back part of this island. As I'm walking through there, it's very reminiscent to this place I went to in 2011. I went down in northern Peru to a ayahuasca retreat, in the jungle. And the way this is set up, it looks like that. And I'm so excited, and we go there. And then as soon as we find our spot, I see on the other side of the river, I'm like, oh, there's the friggin' highway. And the whole time you could hear the highway. I've got this huge expectation of really being far away from everything. But at the end of the day, we're right there. And as you said earlier, as I gave you like a little bit of a foreshadowing to this, it's like, that is kind of like where we are right now in terms of like everything which is happening in the world. We can't really escape of what's going on, but we can find our spot with, we can find our location, our solitude within all of the nuts which is going on. So we go and we set up and we have this this really nice little campsite, and we're not the only ones on the island. The guys who are going to go and whose island it is, it's this guy, his brother, and then this other guy, and they've got like these two kids, and the whole thing is like really kind of strange. And we're trying to figure out like what's going on. And we were going to have dinner. They were going to cook dinner one night. So we walked to the other side of the island and we have dinner with them. And as we discover, they're all retired prison guards. And I'm like, what? Like this whole sort. So now we're starting to see like the mindset which we have. We're like, for whatever reason, we're pulled into this experience. Like we had our logical explanation for why we chose this location, but for whatever it is, we came there. And now there's like all of this like prison guard sort of like energy. And I'm like, I don't, that's not my normal social circle. I'm not like hanging out with prison guards very often. And so I'm like, I'm super excited. Like I start interviewing these guys. I'm like, well, tell me about this. Tell me about that. Like, what's the hierarchy like? What is the culture like in there? And I'm finding out all of these stories, and and it's interesting because I have in my own mind, like, what I think, what that mentality would be for like, what a prison guard was. And I'm listening to their interaction with inmates, and I'm seeing like how all of my own sort of things are being broken down of like what I think that person would be or what I think that life would be. And I've got like newfound compassion in one way, and I've got like newfound like, oh, wow, that I didn't think, what do you mean you set them up? And, stuff like that. And so that's going on. So this energy of like control system and prison system and all of that's going on. And then they start sharing with me the history of the island. Because, a lot of like what this Susquehanna mystery, particularly where I did the 40th parallel, this is like, if you're familiar with my work and you're familiar with like all of the work I've exposed of Scranton, Pennsylvania, this is probably about 40 miles downstream from Scranton, PA. And I didn't realize this, but where we were was like, has over like 6,000 years of continuous archaeological history of like people living here. And usually when you have like 6,000 years of continuous history of people living in any particular area, at least from one level, you can explain it for like, well, it's because geographically, this was the confluence of rivers, or there was this or that. There was like it was very convenient for life for this reason. And it didn't seem to have any of those obvious explanations. So I'm sitting in this sort of energy of like, okay, I'm dealing with prisoners. I'm dealing with like, this whole prison thing. I'm also looking at like, this is like a very significant location to human beings for 6,000 years. It's Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. If you want to look on a map, I think that's a city now or a town now of maybe 10,000 people. So that's sizable. But what I think is so interesting, and where I want to kind of like wrap this up, and I'm going to hand it off to you, is, we shut off all phones. Like part of like this trip was like to get away from everything. And when I came back, like I got messages from a bunch of people to see this new video that came out called ShadowNet.
Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm seeing that, and I was listening to that on the whole car ride home, and every single company which they mentioned,
mm-hmm.
they're headquartered in Tyson's Corner.
Okay, this is great. This is going to wrap perfectly into where we're going to start the next portion of this.
Exactly. So I'm coming back from the trip. You and I have talked like, the last, I think it was 2 episodes ago, we're talking all about Tyson's Corner and like what's going on there. And that's the real prison. That's the real prison. You know, we're tapping into this, like, you know, it's if, in my personal opinion, the way Mike sees the world, like for the most part, like the people who are the inmates and the people who have to control the inmates, like that is a byproduct of a sick culture. And so I'm seeing that, but now we're going on to like another level, and that's of like what's creating that. And so now we're coming in and we're seeing all of these different sort of energies in play, whether it's the military industrial complex, whether it's like, you know, all of like this group, which we're doing right here, but this is what's bubbling up. So it's with that, I want to go and pass the baton back on to you and hear your thoughts.
Okay, so a couple of things. So first of all, like I love how, because I'm sure you had the fleeting moment when you found out that you were on an island by yourself with a bunch of prison guards. Did I just enter my own cell? Right, on a certain level, right? You know, but rather than going, you know, there with that and just deciding to hide on your side of the island away from them, you decided to engage them, right? Like, kind of in a very interesting way, right?
I love that. I mean, I just love people, and I love people who are outside of my world experience. Like, when else am I going to be able to go and interview 3 prison guards?
Right. So instead, like a lot of people would be like, okay, I'm here with prison guards. I'm afraid they're watching me. You're like, yeah, fuck it. I'm going to interview them. I'm going to turn, you know, I'm going to sort of turn this sort of table around. I'm going to interview them. I'm going to learn some things about their psychology, which is interesting, but also about sort of the history of this place. And I like, so what's funny is you had this vacation with no technology, and just 3 days ago or 2 days ago, which I assume is when you were there, Laura and I were both the same day, both said we would like to go on a vacation with no technology, right? So, you know, the appeal of that, but then to find yourself on an island with prison guards right next to the highway where you thought you were going to be out in this great natural sanctuary away from everything with no, like that's kind of, so yesterday I had a trip to the water myself. Yesterday we decided we needed to go to the beach. So when we're there at the beach and facing the ocean, you can forget about all the nuts on a certain level that's going on, because none of the people at the beach were wearing a mask. Some people back on the road were, but Pacific Coast Highway is right there, right? So you're still hearing all the noise and that kind of thing. So we were having kind of a similar experience where you're there with nature and there's the water, and this way you're kind of away from reality, but back here all the noise is going on and the mask wearing and the traffic and whatnot. But I think that's exactly as things are right now. It's going to be learning to have your reality parallel to the reality that is going on all around you, and being able to you know, like be conscious of that. Like, I don't think just like tuning everything out is a really wise idea. Momentarily, sometimes it's good, but being able to fully be present and engaged in the experience that you're having, right? While like aware that all this stuff is going on around you is like the new kind of mindset people have to sort of get to, you know? And so I think that was representative of that. What you said, oh, my cat is scratching and isn't going to leave me alone until I let her in. Hold on a second, guys. Sorry. There we go. Okay. All right, Olive is with us now. So anyway, so I thought that was really interesting. Just out of curiosity, before we step any farther, any very interesting stories from these guys about the sort of prison culture, or their that you think are of value, or anything like that?
I've got a personal interest in, like, I'm fascinated by like the prison concept. Mm-hmm. And I like to, you know, I that's a guilty pleasure of mine, like prison gangs and what's it like, and like, mm-hmm. and asking them, like, tell me about the hierarchies of inmates, and talk about the different cultures within prisoners. And so I found they told me some interesting stories about that. You know, nothing like which really jumped out. The one thing he did tell me, this is what he told me, is like there was a relatively high-level member of some gang who, right before he was released, said he just got a job with the TSA at or the equivalent of the TSA at an airport in I forget where, in a city in Mexico, and the guy's like, he didn't believe him at all, and he goes and he shows him, and this guy was a very high-ranking member within this one particular gang, and he was showing me just like I mean, that was part of it, is just like how organized the corruption is.
Mm-hmm.
And then also what he said, which I thought was interesting, was the guy said that he ran the snitch program in the prison. I'm like, there was an organized snitch program? He's like, yes. And he was telling me how like it used to all be like kind of like this like under the radar, like it's official, like everyone knows, like within the administration of the prison, of like, you know, this is how we gather information, and like we have the snitch program. But then how it became a state-run program, and how they used to pay the snitches more or less in the currency of cigarettes, but then they started getting actual money from the state. They're like, you know, like the snitch program dried up immediately because it became official and people's names got in databases and stuff like that. And then secondly, it was like, you know, cash doesn't really have any place within the prison economy. Like, it's like, you know, it does like a little bit. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But what I found most interesting was listening. Like, I would listen to them and they would say something, and I would drill down in questions to really get into what I would think of is like, you know, the psychology and the value system of these guys. And for the most part, I would say they were men of integrity. And how I'm going to define integrity is like their actions and their thoughts were the same. Doesn't necessarily mean I agree with them, but they're not in contradiction. And I was listening to what they would say and how they thought about inmates. And they had like some real like shitty stories about inmates, and some like really like, you know, these were inmates who we respected and who we like, you know, almost like the old Looney Tune cartoons of like, you know, at the end of the day, Wile E. Coyote and like the Roadrunner, they like, you know, they're clocking in and clocking out, and they just recognize they have their job to do in this, like this game of life. Yep. And what Jen and I were,
you just said game of life. Okay. That will become important later. So go on.
So when Jenny and I were coming back, we were doing just like this, you know, just a juxtaposition of, you know, within our world. You know, we know a lot of people who would fall within the category of like, let's say, like, you know, they get the stamp of like the good, liberal-minded, progressive individual. And we know how that person would put these prison guards with all of their political signs, like what that person would think of the prison guard. And we're like, I don't think these prison guards would have the same level of disdain of their enemy, and being able to see that. And we thought that was very interesting and telling, and an observation which was, you know, worthy of note, at least in our car conversation on the ride home.
Yeah. All right. A couple things I want to address. I'm going to address first the thing with the prison gangs and snitches and all that kind of stuff, and then the issue we brought up about integrity, about living a life of integrity kind of thing. Okay. So the first thing, so yeah, I actually like, I have, you know, I have a very good friend who was in federal prison for more than 10 years for stuff mostly related to drugs, right? You know, and he's incredibly intelligent, and I think he's probably actually very similar to us. He likes to watch this program, so you know who you are out there if you're watching and whatnot. But I knew him from the party scene in Texas, and we had some very interesting conversations both before he went to prison, while he was in prison, and since he's been out. And this is a person who went from 10 years in federal prison to, you know, he has a very respectable job now in a place you'd never expect a person could work after that. He's really turned his life around. But he, you know, it was always interesting to hear about what goes on in prison from him. And then my stepbrother, who passed away shortly after he got out of jail, had an interesting year in jail as well. So I'm very familiar with the culture in there. And then I also, and this probably will surprise people a little bit, but this is actually where like some of my education on mind control and things started. I, for a while, got very interested in criminal justice. Right. And that I switched my major in college to that for a while. Right. And I did very well. And it was hilarious. Like I was still on drugs and I'd go to class on drugs and like master the class, which most of the people in there were like the teachers, and the people they'd have coming to speak with us were like narcotics officers and agents. And right. It was kind of interesting, but there very much is a societal structure in there. It's very organized. It's not very different than government in there. Right. Like in a lot of ways, but also, have you ever, Jesse Ventura wrote a book about the gangs of government kind of thing, right? Like, you know, the Republicans and the Democrats are really like the Crips and the Bloods and all that kind of stuff. And he had some interesting insights about that kind of thing. But also, it's very well acknowledged that the government was very jealous of how well the mafia operated. Right. And in more modern iterations of the way government deploys things like intelligence agencies and homeland security and things like that, it's very much modeled after the way mafia did things and the way prison systems were run and whatnot. So that doesn't surprise me, you know, about the guy going to work for the TSA after, and then about those snitch programs. One of the things I know from my friend who was in prison is the only currencies that really count in prison are like cigarettes, drugs, and stamps. Stamps are the way that they actually trade in there, right? Because you can trade, like that's the currency in the prison, because you can trade the stamps for other things, kind of thing. So it's like a representative of cash, or at least it was then. I don't know. He's been out for like a while, but that was kind of interesting. So yeah, it is fascinating, and to hear, you know, that whole to be able to just sit there and listen to that, I'm sure was super interesting. But what you said about that you felt like these people lived their life in integrity because they lived as they believed, like that's actually like been a big thing. So Matt, I'm going to do a show with Michael Joseph this week, and that's kind of going to be sort of the backbone of what we're going to talk about, is like morality or integrity. And that, you know, it isn't so much about whether you agree with what another person thinks or is doing, but having respect for them if they're living according to what they say they believe. Right, kind of thing. So that was interesting that that came up with them as well. And I liked what you said also about how that you didn't feel like they would have the same kind of judgments against the people that are quote unquote their enemies as those people would have against them. Right. I find that's pretty much across the board. Like, right, like that goes to so Laura and I were having a conversation this morning about some of the challenges with our families, right? And like for me, it's the, you know, like my sister is who I love very much, but is the epitome of the academic SJW, right? Like the professor that is, you know, like fighting racism by agitating for more racism kind of thing, right? And like when she disagrees with me, she, like the look she gets on her face and the tone she takes in her voice is one of like absolute scorn and disdain for me, right? Like, whereas when I sort of, you know, when I disagree with what she's saying, like if I find more humor in it, right? Like I do, she is living according to what she believes, but she has vast judgment, you know, but she also thinks we shouldn't judge people, and she's being very judgmental of me because I don't, you know, it's very interesting. So yeah, no, I agree with you. I think people who have jobs like the ones like being a prison guard, right? Like that brings those things into really sharp focus, right? And you obviously have two kinds. You have the kinds that end up like what you're talking about, and then you have the kinds that become like the corrupt cop that wears their, you know, hat far back on their head and has the big belly and their baton and whatnot, and it goes one way or the other. So it's interesting. Like I think that like that never in a million years would you have ever expected that you were going to have the complete prison education.
It was the best. Like
Yeah.
I've known people in prison, so I've heard like I've asked those questions.
Mm-hmm.
So like to hear, I've not had this. That was definitely fascinating. This was the other thing which I really liked too. They said in every prison there's always one guy who's like at the top.
Yep.
Like there's one guy, and like and understand and getting into that, that's what I found fascinating. I'm like, how does that person, how did they get there? And it's like, the amount of pool they have outside of the prison. And they would tell me stories about how they would influence other prisoners through influencing their family members outside of the prison.
Yep.
And then their family members would come back and be like, you got to stop what you're doing right away.
So just like the way our government works. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That by using blackmailing and brownstoning and all of that kind of stuff to keep people in line with, with the overall point, thing that they're going for. Absolutely. There was one other thing that I wanted to say.
Game of life.
Oh, we'll get to that in a second. But the other thing is I also kind of fetishize some of this prison stuff. Some of the best TV shows and movies have been prison TV shows and movies, right? Like Orange is the New Black. It was fairly interesting look at women's prisons, right? It got kind of silly in the last season or two, but in the beginning it was quite fascinating. And then one of my favorite movies of all times was The Shawshank Redemption. You see that movie?
Definitely. I wanted to ask him about that. I didn't, but that's what I was the whole time. Like I'm talking to him, I'm like, this is the image which has been put in my head by media of what I believe a prison guard is like.
Yeah.
And so like, as they're like sharing me these stories, like, that's the best I got.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask my friend Shannon for some more. I just blew his name there. Oops, so well. I'm gonna ask him about if he has any interesting stories about the prison guards and stuff, because he's kind of interesting like that. He'd make friends with some of these guys, or have ones he respected and ones he thought were ridiculous and whatever. I'm gonna ask for a little more intel on that. Okay, we're gonna go on to the stories that I'm gonna share because it'll connect to the game of life, right? All right, so let's see. Here, okay, so this person, I'm just going to call her D because I don't know if she wants to be talked about publicly or not, but she reached out to me after our third episode when we were just starting to begin to think about rolling this into something else. And she had this interesting little thing she told me about that I thought I liked, and it will go into the Tyson's Corner stuff and whatnot and the game of life sort of here. So she said, "Hi, Emily, thanks for the great discussion with Michael. 3.2. I have had these types of experiences for a very long time. I could actually write a book. I wouldn't say I'm targeted, but apparently I am watched. So after many, many years of synchronicity and bizarre experiences daily, I lovingly refer to whoever's orchestrated this as, quote unquote, my team. They showed me years ago this image. When I was a child, there was a little game board. It was magnetized, and you could maneuver your little car on top of the board from a magnet underneath. I feel like someone has been doing this with my life. There isn't a day of my life that goes by that I don't question this reality," right? So I liked this idea, and there's one of her stories later, she actually says the game of life, and I'll see if I can find that one in a second, because it's funny, because she actually literally says the game of life. But I liked this kind of idea of a little magnetized game board, right? Where, a couple of things I liked about her story. I liked that that was the episode where we talked about targeted individuals, right? And she's already in that space where she wasn't seeing herself as targeted, but as being watched. And my conversation with her sort of revolved around, like, what would it take to move you from the space of being watched to being like you're the one orchestrating all of this, right? So we kind of had a conversation about that. But I liked this idea of a little game board because you and I had this conversation about the Tyson's Corner, right? And certain places that we've been at certain places times in our life. And I had been thinking even before she sent this to me, like, what if it really is like when we're thinking about having been targeted or being part of projects or programs that like, it isn't all so intricately woven where like you're being monitored every second all the time. What if there's some kind of idea inserted just to make sure that at a certain point in your life, you pop up at a certain location or that you are drawn to certain locations and it almost, they can check up on whatever kind of programming is going on, or that's where something will occur, because you and I both had this thing where even though we grew up on opposite ends of the country, doing totally different things, we both found ourselves at one point in our life magnetically attracted to the Tyson's Corner Mall. Right? Like magnetically. Like every time I would go down to Washington, D.C. to visit, to do whatever, I would always on the last day, go to the Tyson's Corner Mall, right? Spend some time there, and then I drive home, and I always would have that shit where I would be falling asleep in the car on the way home, right? Even though it was only like a 3-hour, 2.5-hour drive back, right? Now, one of the thing that I noticed back then that was interesting about the Tyson's Corner Mall was that there were 2 gaps inside of it. There was a gap on one end of the mall and a gap on the other end of the mall, right? And so even at that, like, I was 18. I didn't have the familiarity with certainly like any kind of occult information or anything like that I have now. But I thought that was incredibly odd. Why would you have 2 gaps in the same mall? And it wasn't like they have now where there's like a baby gap and a grown-up gap or whatever. It was 2 Gap stores that had basically all of the same stuff, right? So what would be the purpose of that? I thought that was interesting then. But also just this draw to there. Like it couldn't have been, sure, that we know that like they put these things on magical destinations to draw people there to spend money and to put energy into them or whatever. But that isn't really what I was doing there. You know, I just couldn't not go there. And you were just going there to eat lunch. I imagine you weren't going there to spend a lot of money or do a lot of shopping, right? But what you're saying about all of these programs that are there, like what if it like was literally like that, you know, without our knowing it, we were just voluntarily every day going to some spot, which is where we were being programmed or where like we were dumping somehow recon intelligence for or something like that, or even just there's something about our energy that adds to the pot there. And so, right, or maybe it wasn't anything that someone else was trying to do, but for some reason, we grew up around those kinds of environments and those kinds of projects, and we sense that energy when we feel it, and we can't help but going, I don't know what it is, but what do you think about that? That we were both sort of magnetized to repetitively appear at this place for a short period of our life, but it seemed very important at the time.
So I can speak like, well, one, I think you're definitely on to something. What I don't know, or like, or where I'm more open to like investigation is the location intrinsically have that magnetism, or was that like created?
Okay.
Because yeah. Tyson's is you know, a handful of miles away from Langley, from the CIA headquarters. It's where all of like the military industrial complex, this is where it is. Like, you know, you've got the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, but you don't see those companies headquartered on the Maryland side. There's the Maryland side and the Virginia side. Maryland's like Bethesda, Chevy Chase, that sort of thing, Silver Spring. It's all in this Tyson's Corner, Arlington, McLean, and like at the beginning, and it's gone further like west to like Reston and so forth. So I grew up in Columbia, Maryland, and we talked a little bit about that. Columbia, Maryland is, if you were to look at a map, it is probably like 10 miles away from NSA headquarters, okay? Mm-hmm. If you then, if you know anything about like city planning and stuff like that, Columbia, Maryland has a certain significance within city planning, which within the United States. And there's one other city, small city, which is kind of thought of like Columbia in terms of like how it was designed, and then its influence in terms of other cities, with planned cities which have been developed afterwards. And that is Reston, Virginia. And so you go and you look at like Reston, Virginia's relationship to Langley. It's very, very similar to Columbia, Maryland's relationship to the NSA. So, okay, so let me go. So let's talk about where you grew up. Like, I don't know enough about like, you know, all of the different organizations and like the city planners, but my guess is there is a magnetism, and that magnetism could be as much as like how consciousness was formed through the actual schooling, like Columbia, Maryland education, and Reston/Fairfax County. This is Fairfax County, Virginia. They're both like known from like
Money Magazine mainstream perspective of like, these are great school programs. Like, well, these are programs which were designed to create a certain way of understanding reality. Jordan Maxwell has done such an amazing job, I think, at explaining, like, this is why you wear the mortarboard hat. This is what the education process is, to design you to think a certain way. Mm-hmm. Now, that what Jordan says is general. What I'm saying is specific. Columbia, Maryland, like maybe Fairfax, Virginia, maybe where you were educated, and maybe even more so like the projects for like the identified children within them, they were identified for a certain level of consciousness, like a certain frequency, like however they want to measure that, because there's infinite ways. And maybe that's where that magnetism comes from. But then Tyson's in particular, Tyson's more so than really anywhere else. Tyson's is the Silicon Valley, and let's say all the way up to like Seattle for that matter, is known for software development. We think of that as like technology, and this is where technology comes from with computers. But that's just like the whiz bang, like sexy stuff. The real stuff, the infrastructure, the telecommunications, which allows that the software to exist upon, that all comes from Tyson's Corner. And that's magnetism. That's where we get all of this stuff. Tyson's Corner is probably, like, you've got Tyson's 1 and Tyson's 2. Yep. I would be surprised, like, the literal magnetism of the technology which is in that ground, like from there running along those roads from Langley to Dulles Airport, who's Dulles named after, the Dulles brothers. Who are they? What are they behind? They're the CIA guys. It's all the same thing. They're the ones, if you think about it, like the reason why Dulles Airport, they built Dulles Airport. I'm kind of, if you have a map, I encourage anyone, if you're not familiar with the area, to go look at it. Dulles Airport is connected to Langley and all of those places by what's called the toll road, the Dulles toll road. And they built that road. I don't know when they did that, probably in the 70s or 80s, but that's when they're laying all probably the 80s, is when they laid all of the infrastructure also for like the fiber optics and so forth to create those magnetism. And it goes right underneath Tyson's Corner. So yes, of course it's going to be part of like a literal magnetism.
Yeah. So, okay. So in Chatsworth, right, one of the things that I was reminded of as I ended up on my little side loop today with Chatsworth is that really, like, some of the most reputable private schools in Los Angeles are all in Chatsworth, right? So there used to be one called Chatsworth Hills Academy, which was the school that was where the summer camp was. So it was a summer camp in the summer, right? And then Olivia is just going bazonkers. Now she wants, hold on just a second. Olivia, stop it. Okay. So the school and the camp, so Chatsworth Hills Academy was a very exclusive private school in the hills of Chatsworth, where the summer camp was, in the summertime. There is now some school there called like Horizon Academy. I can't remember exactly what it's called. Jeff and I were there sort of last year. It seems to be some kind of school more for like Middle Eastern or Persian kids or something like that now. That was kind of interesting. So that's right there where the summer camp is. I went to Egremont, which is a school like that gives a particular kind of French education, but it's right there on Devonshire. It's on Devonshire that we talked about. And it used to look like a normal school when I was a kid, but now they've redone it and it looks like a castle. They like turned it into a castle. So the school is literally a castle on Devonshire Road kind of thing, right? Devonshire, it's very interesting. But I didn't go to there's also another private school in Chatsworth that's very reputable. Like it really highly colleges recruit like tons from there. It's called Sierra Canyon. These are all like some of the best private schools in Los Angeles, so probably also in the country. But one of the things that I recognize that I received at the private school that I went to, different than a lot of the people's, I received an actual like trivium education, right? Where you learned how to think as opposed to what to think.
What to think, yeah.
right? And so it was different, right? Like it was different, and that that it definitely bled into. I mean, for me, everything was kind of an interesting combination of the things that went on at the school, the things that went on at the summer camp, the things that went on at the gym for me, and then the things that were going on with the Hollywood involvement kind of stuff, right? But back, Chatsworth maybe wasn't planned in the same way as Columbia or Reston. The place that I would suggest taking a look at to find that kind of planned community that's here in California is a city called Irvine. Like it was a project from a university kind of thing on creating, there's UC Irvine is there, right?
Right.
A fully planned city. But I do know from my conversations with Andrew Bishago that the point of Chatsworth as they developed it into a suburb, and we lived there pretty, we moved there in the 70s, was, there had been stuff there since I think about the 50s, right? Like living, neighborhoods built, but was to bring together people working in like technology and people working in academics, or people working in some our next door neighbors worked at Lytton, right? Like at Lytton, which is, connected to IG Farben and all that kind of stuff, right? And my mother worked at Atlantic Richfield, which is ARCO, which is a gasoline company. And my father worked at Pierce College, right? And there was people who worked in schools in the neighborhood and people who worked at some of these like Rocketdyne and what's the other, Boeing and whatnot that's back there, right? So that was sort of the idea there. And then of course, Chatsworth was on like a Native American burial ground kind of thing. So there's that history. But
can I pause you for 1 second? Because I want to go back to the Chatsworth Hill School.
Yeah.
Okay, so it was founded by Liz Shapiro.
Okay.
All right. So I just pulled her up real quick and I read her obituary. Obituaries are one of the best ways to find out about folks. So 2 things. I've been reading this book which was given to me like 5 years ago. I never wanted to read it, but I just started reading it. And I don't know if you ever heard of it. It's called, I'll show it right here. It's called the Gaia Matrix. And it's all about like this, this guy lays out ley lines and really explains it very, very much about the Northeast United States. And he talks very, very specifically about what's known as the Finger Lakes region of New York. And he makes this really compelling story about the significance of this location. So, okay. So your lady, Liz Shapiro, that's where she grew up. She grew up in Syracuse, New York, which is right in the head, right where all of this Iroquois Nation, like a very significant part of Iroquois Nation, and where this guy says is the epicenter of this Gaia matrix is, or at least one of the biospheres are. And then she moved to Endicott, New York, which is right on the Susquehanna River and is the home of IBM, where IBM began. So like, at least from a consciousness, energetic sort of level, like this woman came through that sort of, that is within her actual DNA experience, or maybe not her DNA, but from her, like her existential, her existence. Like she's been through that. And then she went and she created what you're describing.
Okay. So I didn't go to Chatsworth Hills. You're going to love this. I didn't go to Chatsworth Hills Academy, but I went to the Ranch Club summer camp, right? And when I went years later and tried to do research on it, there's nothing there. But my father remembered that the guy who ran the Ranch Club summer camp was someone that he worked with at Pierce College, of course, right? And so he remembered his name. And so we were able to find reference to the Ranch Club summer camp by looking up his obituary. Right. And I found it mystifying that, you know how you can find something on Facebook for everything? I couldn't believe that there was not like kids that attended Ranch Club in the 70s Facebook group, right? Nothing. There's no reference to Ranch Club anywhere online except for in this obituary. And when I went and read the obituary, there was something very interesting in it that made me know that it was there so that if people like me went looking for it, there was literally an MK Ultra trigger phase. If you've ever read Dave McGowan's work, and when he talks about how the Sheriff Moose read a poem when they were trying to catch those DC shoe snipers, like he got on air and read a poem because he was trying to reprogram them so they'd come back, kind of thing. So, okay, so I've just pulled up the obituary again. So this is the guy running the camp on the same campus as the school, right? His name is Leon Fenwick, right? And he has a couple of interesting things about him. He created, or he developed, what's called the University Racket Club, right? Which is like a tennis association for college tennis players. Now, I'm a terrible tennis player, but for some reason that I've never been able to figure out, I'm obsessed with tennis, right? And so he created this culture of like tennis clubs where people get together and play tennis, but also talk about tennis and develop culture about tennis. And I've always talked more about the sort of symbolic nature of it or the social aspect of it or whatever, because I'm a terrible player. So I thought that was interesting, first of all. So maybe somehow tennis was used in some things with me as a kid. But it talks about the ranch club here. It said, so he developed he was a tennis player and he developed this university racket club. And in 1964, the family moved to California, where Leon continued his career in education. He went on to develop the Ranch Club Summer Day Camp in Chatsworth. Leon was an avid one-time nationally ranked tennis player who thoroughly enjoyed the sport throughout his lifetime. So rolls down a little bit here. And then listen to this, right? Okay, so when they're describing where the memorial is going to take place, and I knew this because like it's such shadow twilight language. This is what it says: travel down the lane of California pepper trees that Leon planted and nurtured. Follow the green balloons. The south side of the property is lined by railroad tracks. Turn right and travel up the lane of large pines. Right? Like all of those things in there are references to the tie between this man and that land and whatnot. But if you go listen to some of like the things that have been used to trigger or so if people are looking to find information on the ranch club and all they're going to find is this, like if they're trying to figure out what happened to me at the ranch club, right? And fortunately, I knew about this stuff before I went looking for it. And they read that line, it almost sends them right back there and takes them out of the loop of figuring things out and brings them right back into their mind control, right? Like, that kind of thing. So they had for him his burial or whatever, his memorial right there at this camp, right? Years after the camp was no longer operating. Like the camp.
Did you see the memorial? Did you see the burial?
I didn't see the burial.
Were you a child? Like, when does that fit within your story? Like when you were.
He died in 2011.
Oh, okay. So this was way after you were. Okay.
Right.
All right.
But it's an Indian burial ground. I remember when I went to summer camp there, we used to do some like rituals to try and draw the Indians out of the mountains and things like that. Like the weirdest shit ever. Right. But so we're both looking at obituaries of people. She ran the school, he ran the camp, right? So school would be much more along the lines of technology, right? And things like that, and IBM and software, and summer camp is more about physical activities. Now, what was interesting, so he was the athletic director his kid, Jim Fenwick, was the football coach at the college my dad worked at, and his wife, Jan, and his daughters were gymnastics coaches. Now, they were never my gymnastics coaches, but it brings together this whole thing for me of like summer camp gymnastics and tennis, right? Kind of thing. Like I wasn't playing tennis, but it's so interesting. So he's there on that same spot running the summer camp. She's there running the school. And it's sort of, I don't know that I have a cohesive thing to this yet, but it's very interesting, right? Like, and what is there? So on that, go ahead.
Well, I don't finish your train of thought because I want to reflect on this because I got something really reflective of that.
Okay, so when Jeff and I were there last year, and Jeff is like, Emily's taking me to her silly place. She thinks this Chatsworth place is, much more important than it is. And then I take him there, and he's like, oh, this is the weirdest fucking place ever, right? And so I'm showing him all around. I show him the summer camp, and what's really interesting about the summer camp is there's a little railroad there, right? They talk about it in the thing there, right? There's a little railroad of a defunct, there's no train that actually goes through that part anymore. They built a different one, but it's a little tiny sort of railroad. And the railroad goes up through the Manson Tunnel, which is on the property of the Chatsworth Park, which is where the camp is, and goes right up to where Boeing and Rocketdyne are, right? Like it's a very interesting, so quite literally, like some of the things that we've talked about in terms of like underground bases, under the summer camps and stuff. Like literally, like little kids getting on a little train at some point and leaving the summer camp and going up for their thing at the underground base and a Rocketdyne or or whatever it is. And the little kid might just remember they had a train ride, right? Like that's part of the cover. How fun, we got to go on the train kind of crap, right? Yeah. But trains are really important in all of this. I know, as you've talked about with railroads in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and it's very lots of other people have associated the trains to all of this kind of stuff that we're dealing with. But so there's this little train thing there. And then of course, Jeff and I go up to the top and we do, a session. He does some interesting work with sort of the spirit of the land and things like that. And we do this session, it is meaningful to me because of my personal experiences there. And then 2 days later, the huge fires in Chatsworth break out that spread from Chatsworth to Malibu, almost like whatever we cleared, something, the land reacted kind of thing. So it's an incredibly powerful place, right? The amount of, the Manson, the Manson, all that stuff with, what's her name? I can't think of her name right now. The whole thing with the Manson case, the woman who died.
The one who was Roman Polanski's wife?
Yeah. That's all stuff. It's all there in Chatsworth. Spawn ranches.
Rosemary's Baby? What was her name? Like, Rosemary's Baby is so significant.
Sharon Tate. But there's a huge connection between all the stuff that went on in Laurel Canyon, like Dave McGowan's work and the stuff over in Chatsworth. It's a fascinating place. Let's hear your reflections.
So, okay, the Rosemary's Baby. So Rosemary's Baby coupled with the movie The Wicker Man, the first Wicker Man, not the one that was made with Nick Cage. They're really, really significant in terms of understanding how groups of people who are in on the same page or on the same playbook can create a false reality for the person who doesn't realize they're being targeted. So I think about that a lot. So, okay.
Yeah.
So I have a preschool which I went to when I used to live in Richmond, Virginia, which I have an internal knowing that I'm like, something happened there. I don't know what it was. Like, I'm not even suggesting it was anything particularly nefarious, but I'm like, something is in my unconscious which drives me there. And the school is called the Sabbath School. And one of the things which has always intrigued me about that is just the idea of like how Sabbath has multiple meanings, and particularly when we think of like a witch's Sabbath. That's what I think is why I'm like the Rosemary's Baby thing is coming full circle. But what's so interesting about this is I have searched extensively for this. And this was like kind of like this is the 70s. And this was, at the time, this was like a cutting edge educational program in Richmond, Virginia in the 70s. And there's nothing on it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I can find references that it existed. Mm-hmm. I just can't find anything like who the people were, what made it so different, and what was special about it. And most interestingly, this is my memory. This is the only the only memory I have. It feels more like a dream memory. Like, when you remember your dreams, you're like, I know I'm blending things. Like, I know this isn't a straight memory. I'm blending things. But I just remember being a kid and my mother showed up, did not pick me up. And I was the only one there, and I'm watching a funeral. All I remember was like I was in my preschool, and right across the fence there was a funeral, and I'm just watching a friggin' funeral. It's the only memory I have of Sabbath. So, and it's the same way you're saying, like there's no history to it, but I can find things about it, but I can't find anything. But then you went to Moose. You went to Moose out of nowhere. We've never talked about that. Mm-hmm. I was working this is 2011 or 2001. Was it 2001? No, it wasn't. It was following that. It was shortly following that. It was September 11th, 2001. I was working in Reston, Virginia when that happened. Reston, Virginia is in the whole Tyson's corridor. I left technology. That was my last job within the technology industry. Like I had like a promising career in the technology industry. I'm like, I'm getting out of that. And I left that and I worked for an architect. And that architect's office was across the street from Tyson's 2, which is about 2 blocks away from Tyson's 1.
Yeah. And it's fancy that Tyson's too. Yeah.
Yeah, that's super fancy.
Yeah.
And so Tyson's, this is right when the whole sort of DC sniper thing was happening. So I'm living in that area and I can remember all this stuff. I remember my wife then was like terrified. And there's part of me which had absolutely like no concern about that, but I was fascinated because I was living there.
Yeah.
If you happen to remember any of the details related to that, there was one of the shootings which was at Home Depot. There's a Home Depot.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
I was living in Arlington, Virginia at the time, probably about 4 miles away from Langley. If you go look on a map, I was living, here's where it gets even freakier. If you're familiar with the area of Arlington, Virginia, like I was living in the subdivision, which was known as Yorktown. I lived in the same place where Eric Schmidt grew up. It's like, not like they're expensive houses now, but these are like 1940s Cape Cod. So I was living there. I remember this so clearly. For whatever reason, I get up. I'm like, I got to go to Home Depot. I drive, and it was like, we just bought the house, my wife and I at the time. It was kind of like a fixer-upper. So I'm always going to Home Depot. But I remember being like, internally, I got to go to the Home Depot. I drive there, and I remember my wife said to me, she's like, be careful of the sniper. And I remember laughing at it. It was 10 minutes after I left that Home Depot.
Yep.
That the sniper shot. And all I know is like, why did I go there at that time?
Yeah.
So the reason I'm bringing this up is like magnetism. Like, I'm not saying I was the shooter or I was to be shot, but I'm like, what the hell is all this stuff?
But so a couple of things. So one of the things, like for me, when I was really trying to break programming hard, right? I kept having fear of going to I was afraid, suddenly got afraid to go to the Dodger game, that some big attack was going to happen and they were going to blame it on me, right? Kind of thing. So literally whenever any of these events happen, like I have a feeling a number of people who have been project kids, assets at some point, patsies or whatever, are literally drawn to that space so that like they have plenty of fall guys in place to take the blame, kind of thing. Right? Kind of thing. Or whether they be as a victim of it or whether something gets blamed on them, right? And it also could literally just be that there's a frequency being put out that actually draws the person there, that because you went through a similar set of programming draws you too. And what actually better way would there be to get rid of evidence than to like get rid of old MKs or whatever that they're not wanting to have to deal with because they know we're going to wake up and do what we're doing kind of now, or whatever kind of thing, right? Than having them show up at these places and be victims of the whatever or something, right? So that they're not concerned about the fact that multiple people might be drawn to the site. I think that's probably like pretty likely. So Dave McGowan, like there's a reason they had to take Dave McGowan out. There's lots of reasons why, but I don't know if you ever read his earlier book. Everyone knows him for Weird Things Inside the Canyon, but his earlier book called Program to Kill, where he talked about serial killers and summer camps and how all of these serial killers were connected to each other based on the summer camps that they went to. Right? Like,
oh, I did not read this.
Yeah. I mean, so I've read snippets of the book. I don't actually have the book, but I've listened to a lot of commentary on it and I've read parts of it that he had posted on his website. I'm going to get it. I need to get it. He also has an interesting book about fascism called The Real Meaning of the F Word. But he basically, the serial killer was like a made up thing to have one person to blame for intelligence agencies taking out people that were no longer useful to them. Like, right. This was all MK Ultra kind of stuff and right. And so that is fascinating to me that you were drawn to that same sort of drawn to that place. But yeah, I've always been fascinated too by serial killers. Right? Like I was terrified of the Night Stalker when I was a kid. I couldn't stop watching. And a lot of that stuff happened right around where I grew up, lived and stuff like that. So there is something about that. I'm going to have to go take a deeper dive into that book and see. But yeah, it is funny that I brought up moose. I had no idea your connection.
Well, that is, yes. And let me just say two things, then maybe we'll go break for like the second half.
Yeah.
One is like, as you going back to where all of this, and this is what I think is so fun about these conversations, because we don't know where it's going to go, is this began with the question you asked, what do you think it is about Tyson's and like the magnetism?
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about, we have to at least be open to this idea that the technologies which are actually out there are so far beyond like what we know. Like, I mean, that's like they're 100, the real top secret's 100 years beyond what we think top secret is.
Yeah.
So like part of like the people who may be programs, like they are the actual transmitters.
Absolutely. And one more thing I want to say, and then we're going to break, is I too was drawn into this, watching this Shadowgate. Everybody, I could, like, people were trying to force it on me, right? Like it started on Friday afternoon after this weird thing that happened on the Alex Jones show where the girl got like arrested, whatever it was, right, kind of thing. And I'm like, at certain points, I'm like, why is everyone trying to draw my attention to this? Like, this feels like more of the same kind of bullshit that, you know, to that right kind of thing. But what you're saying, I didn't realize that those companies that you're talking about are in that same spot right there in Tyson's Corner, Virginia. So for me, to a certain extent, like, to me, a lot of the story is more of just the same, people exposing stuff, people getting arrested, you know, whatever kind of thing. Like, okay, like I already know that, why am I watching it? But this is fucking fascinating, that all of that surveillance technology, all of that asset monitoring technology emanates there from Tyson's Corner.
Yeah.
So for the purpose of this conversation is why I was being forced to listen to and watch hours around all of this Shadowgate stuff, right?
And I haven't seen it. Like I turned my phone off Friday afternoon.
Yeah.
Like, I have no idea what you're even talking about, like the Alex Jones thing. Like all I know is I turned my phone off Friday. I went on the prison island.
Yeah.
I went on the prison island. We had a mushroom experience. And like, with the prison guards. And they kept on walking in on us. And like, like Pennsylvania is not really like a nudist sort of place, like pro-nudist. And like, I just like to be nude all the time. And like, so they're all walking around and we're like all mushroomed out. And it was the funniest friggin' thing. And so, and then like so today when we came back, turned on the phone and I saw this, multiple people like forwarded that on to me. Yeah. And so like I watched like maybe 15, 20 minutes of it before I turned it off. But so yeah, now to go and have this conversation, you know, and being like these nodal points. So let's go back. What do you and I, and probably all the people who are watching this, who are resonating with it, is like, you know, what are we nodals to? What are we like what are we triangulating in terms of information?
Absolutely. All
right.
For
the second half, let's go start triangulating.
All right, absolutely. So this is a great place to end. So we're going to break off and go into the private working group, and you too can join us there if you guys would like to. So if you would like to jump in and become more of a part of this Project Kids experiment than just an observer, then contact me, technobrat21@gmail.com, and I will let you know how you can do that. And you can find Michael at susquehannaalchemy.com, and you guys know where to find me because you found me right here. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.